Decision day. Alabama voters head to the polls in a hotly contested Senate race. We take you there. Terror aftermath. A man who tried to detonate a bomb in New York subway faces state and federal charges. Boy wonder. A first grader at an Edmonton Catholic school in Canada wins a life-saving award. And reaching the Twitterverse. 5 years ago today, a very holy account opened. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, December 12th, 2017. Alabama Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore rides off from the polls on horseback in Northeast Alabama after he and his wife vote in today's special election, while Doug Jones, the Democrat, casts his ballot outside of Birmingham. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. After a bitter campaign and sexual misconduct allegations against Alabama's Republican candidate, the Senate race goes to the voters.
Move back, gentlemen. Let them through. Let them through. Let them through.
After casting his ballot in Gallant, Republican candidate and former judge, here he goes, gets back on that horse. Sassy is Sassy's name, and he has the full support of the president, but President Barack Obama has been stumping for the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, who says he thinks he'll come out on top.
So at the end of the day, we feel very confident. We went to bed last night knowing that this race has been run in the best way possible with very, very few flaws for it. So we feel good.
Roy Moore denies the sexual allegations and has let the president do much of the talking in the past few days. Coming up later in the show, we will talk to a reporter in Birmingham who has been covering the election with analysis of whether or not the high-profile backers have helped the candidates. The suspect in an attempted terror attack on New York's subway system Monday is set to appear in court, while commuters say things are back to normal in the Big Apple.
I don't think anything of it. New York NYPD is awesome, and I feel very protected by the city, and I feel very protected by the MTA, and I don't have any worries.
The suspect, Akayed Ola, is an immigrant from Bangladesh. He arrived in the U.S. with a family-based visa. He is charged with using a weapon of mass destruction in an attack for the Islamic State that left him and 3 others injured. Joining us now is Congressman Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Wisconsin. He serves on the House Armed Services and Homeland Security Committees. Welcome back to the program.
It's good to be back. Thank you for having me.
You have warned Americans in the past and on this program to take terrorism threats seriously, especially now during the Christmas season. We have seen an attack in New York. Is it something you have expected?
What we saw before over the last couple of years was ISIS in their magazine Dabik started to advertise with pictures of large vehicles asking their adherents to mow down the infidels and the crusaders. And indeed, that's exactly what happened in various European capitals and even in our own country. So, and that magazine, which was called Dabik, referring to a city in Syria, has now been renamed Rumia, which means Rome. And that itself illustrates how the threat is metastasizing and is how, while we squeeze ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we have to be cognizant of the ways in which the threat will metastasize and the threat it poses to our own homeland here.
You've served for 7 years in the United States Marine Corps. You deployed twice to Iraq, and our State Department just congratulated Iraq that the war against ISIS is over after 3.5 years. Russian President Putin went to Syria yesterday to declare victory on ISIS as it does get squeezed, as you mentioned, out of Iraq and Syria. Is that the end?
Absolutely not. We're involved in a generational struggle here. And really, I chair a task force on denying terrorist entry in the United States. And we look at all the ways in which bad guys could get into this country. But really, the most difficult thing to confront is the way in which terrorists cross our borders thousands of times every single day digitally, online. This question of online radicalization, and it looks like the individual in the New York case was radicalized online and took a couple of trips back to Bangladesh. That's an enduring and very difficult problem, and one that we're going to have to leverage every instrument of national security to confront. So we cannot let off the pressure at home.
As a Catholic lawmaker, there is another kind of terrorism that is happening across our country. And it has resulted in the next following things. A Christmas charity event in Spokane, Washington last week had volunteers take training sessions for an active shooter. Church officials on Long Island met with police last week about safety in Christmas services. Is this the new normal for churches and charities?
I would hope not. Listen, there's always been this tension in our society between our freedoms and our liberties and security. And there's always going to be ways in which we may be vulnerable to attack. You can't have 100% perfect security, but I don't think we should accept it as the new normal. I think we need to think about ways in which we can evolve our defenses. But to me, the best defense comes in all of these cases from a strong community with a strong relationship to local law enforcement.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate all the work that you're doing. On behalf of the United States, Merry Christmas to you, Congressman Mike Gallagher, Republican from Wisconsin.
Merry Christmas.
Democratic members of the House call for an investigation into allegations of sexual misconduct against President Trump. Representative Lois Frankel of Florida says the Democratic Women's Working Group has the support of over 100 members. The president tweeted this morning calling an investigation fake news. The Trump administration, meanwhile, appeals the court order, which came down yesterday, allowing transgender people in the military. President Trump ordered a halt to transgender troops, but a federal judge is lifting his ban January 1st. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The Department of Justice filed the appeal on behalf of the Trump administration. They want the case put on hold, which would leave the transgender ban in place. Today, we spoke with a former military chaplain who represents thousands of veterans. He says lifting the ban would be a travesty.
I just think Chaplain Alliance is disappointed in the judge's decision to force the military to take this group. We don't believe it's being fair to the group, to the command, to those that have to serve with them.
Philip Wright is a retired Army colonel. He served 28 years in the military, his home decorated with mementos from that time, mostly spent as a religious chaplain. Wright doesn't question the patriotism of transgender troops, but he says they're a burden on the military and shouldn't be allowed. He says the thousands of other chaplains he represents at the Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty agree with him.
They see this as a religious liberty issue, as we do. The way the policy is written, the rights of those suffering gender dysphoria supersede the rights of anyone else.
The White House remains optimistic. Despite the legal challenges to the transgender policy, President Trump is moving ahead with his promise to rebuild the military. Today, he signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which lays out military spending for 2018. A Department of Justice spokesperson tells me the lawsuits challenging the president's transgender ban are premature, partly because the Defense Department hasn't even completed its own review. Lauren.
White House correspondent Mark Irons, thank you. A group of North Korean women are opening up about the terrifying experiences they endured after they were caught trying to escape the communist country. They are talking to lawmakers on Capitol Hill who are urging defectors to shed light on gross human rights violations. The abuse includes torture and forced abortions. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reports from Capitol Hill. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. The women testifying here are pleading for the U.S. and the world to act. They say they've seen some of the worst human rights violations imaginable: extermination, murder, even sexual enslavement. I spoke with one of those women, Han Gahi, who was a victim of human trafficking. She says that it was her faith in God and keeping a Bible close by that gave her hope.
저는 성경책을 읽을 때 처음에는 성경이
life because it was so harsh, I wanted to die, and that happened many times. But through reading this Bible, these words in the Bible, I was able to find peace. And once I found peace, I came to know God, and I came to know God that He was the grace.
Han Gahi is one of many defectors who listened to a program called Free North Korea Radio while they were trafficked or hiding from abuse in China. Now she works at a South Korean radio station working to help other North Korean women escape. Also testifying today was Hyeona Gi, a defector to China who says she was forced to have an abortion while in prison after being caught and sent back to North Korea. She describes prison life as horrific, even going as far as to say that her captors fed human remains to dogs. Lawmakers, for their part, are hoping to learn more about what's happening to North Korea defectors after they flee. We know China sends back many defectors to North Korea, but the women testifying today are urging the U.S. to do more to protect those defectors who are fleeing persecution. Lauren?
Why, we know Christians are not able to practice their faith in North Korea, and in fact, Open Doors USA put out a study saying that North Korea is the #1 persecutor of Christians worldwide. Did they tell you what life is like in North Korea for them?
Well, Lauren, life is very difficult for Christians in North Korea, as they've described it to me. They're not allowed to openly preach the gospel. They're not even allowed really to own a Bible. All worship is done in secret. So if you're caught, you could go to prison, but it's not just about you. It could even extend to your whole family, who could be tortured as well. Lauren.
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from Capitol Hill. Thank you, Wyatt. The UN Children's Fund says at least 400,000 children under 5 are severely malnourished in parts of Congo. UNICEF says children could die in the Kasai region if they are not urgently reached with aid. The Catholic Church estimated months ago more than 3,300 people have been killed fighting in that region. Clashes continue between Palestinian and Israeli soldiers in Bethlehem. It follows President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Violence rippled across the region following the move, including clashes in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and across the Arab and Muslim world. Pope Francis is implementing reforms at the Vatican initiated by Pope Benedict XVI in 2011. The key focus of those reforms includes financial transparency in the Vatican. The Church is trying to shed its image as a tax haven. A European financial watchdog recently released a report saying the Vatican is making progress, but there's still work to do. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Ed, what does the MoneyVal report say?
Well, the MoneyVal report says, Lauren, that they've been praising the Vatican for taking steps to counter money laundering within the Vatican. They say that there's been progress in that regard. They've praised the Vatican for setting up two departments to deal with this and flagging suspicious transactions. But they criticized the Vatican for not actually bringing people to justice who've been guilty of this. They say there have been 69 cases since 2013, but none of 69? Those cases have resulted in an indictment in those people, yes.
Tell me what the word MoneyVal means, and then let's take a step back and tell me why it's involved in the Vatican's financial affairs.
Right, well, MoneyVal is a committee of experts from the Council of Europe, which aim to counter terrorism, financing of terrorism, and to counter money laundering. And they were brought in by Pope Benedict in 2011 to really clean up the Vatican's finances, to make sure that this money laundering doesn't go on, and so that the Vatican can join what's called the white list, which is the list of nations which are free of this kind of money laundering and financing of terrorism. And so since then, this has been something that they've been analysing sort of every couple of years. They come out with a report to see how the Vatican is progressing. Well,
how likely is it that MoneyVal's concerns and those regarding Vatican finances more generally will be resolved?
Well, it's hard to say, because there are reports that were sort of mentioned in a book that's just come out, which I understand from good sources has been validated, to say that there are obstructions being put in the Vatican by certain Vatican officials, the so-called old guard, who don't want these things to be discovered. Whether that's part of this sort of resistance to indicting certain people is open to question. But certainly what has been seen is that those who appear to wish to blow the whistle on any corruption in the Vatican do end up being indicted, but those who are considered to be suspicious of dealing with some sort of money laundering or corruption have not had any kind of prosecution taken against them or any indictments made against them.
Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks for joining us, Ed.
Thanks, Lauren.
Coming up, the good son, a first grader at a Catholic school in Canada, receives a rare honor. And honoring Our Lady of Guadalupe, millions are expected in Mexico City. We want to wish our Jewish brothers and sisters around the world a happy Hanukkah. The holiday starts at sundown tonight and ends December 20th. The Festival of Lights was first observed more than 150 years before the birth of Jesus. The political world is waiting with bated breath for results from today's Senate race in Alabama between Republican Roy Moore and Democrat Doug Jones. Each has attracted some star power, with the president backing Moore and former President Barack Obama supporting Jones. Amy Yurkinen is an investigative reporter with Birmingham News. Thank you so much for joining us, Amy. I know you've been covering the campaign, the election. What is the mood right now among voters in Alabama?
Well, I think there's a lot of excitement and anticipation. Turnout has been much heavier than it was in the primary and the runoff election. The Secretary of State recently said that their projection of 25% turnout is looking like it's on track. But in certain areas of the state, it feels like it's much heavier than that. It feels more like a general election, really, than a special election.
Polling indicates Doug Jones, the Democrat, has the lead, but it seems that a lot of residents support Roy Moore. Do you think this is going to be another election 2016 when all the polls got it wrong for the presidential race?
Well, the polling has really been all over the place, and I don't think you can necessarily trust any poll at this point. There have been polls that have put Doug Jones ahead. There have been polls that have put Roy Moore ahead, and there's been a really wide range in the results, I think as much as 9 or 10% on either side. So it's really very up in the air.
What have you heard people saying on the ground there on Election Day about the sexual misconduct allegations? Is that playing a factor at all?
It's playing a pretty huge factor. I think that it's motivating Democrats to come out and support Doug Jones, and it's definitely probably kept some voters from coming out. But there are people who support Roy Moore who do not believe that these allegations are true. There are people who think that this is part of a political hit job, and I think that it has motivated those people to also come out and support their candidate. This is obviously the biggest story of this election,
Sure.
So everyone's talking about it, whether they believe them or not.
Well, President Obama, former President Obama, has been campaigning. President Trump has been involved. Steve Bannon has been involved in support of Roy Moore. Is this having a big impact on voters?
I would have to say no on that. I think that the support of outside parties in this election is really not going to be really that helpful to either candidate. Maybe Charles Barkley stumping for Doug Jones because he is an Alabamian could get out some extra voters, but people in Alabama, they aren't really all that interested in hearing what people outside the state have to say.
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Amy Yurkinen, investigative reporter, The Birmingham News.
Thank you so much for having me.
A first grader at a Catholic school in Edmonton receives an award from the city's medical services. Why? He saved his mother's life. In the spring, 6-year-old Ronan Mail found his diabetic mother unconscious. He gave her fruit juice to raise her blood sugar levels, then called 911, where for 10 minutes he provided updates on her condition, cleared a path for paramedics, and unlocked the front door. 6 years old. The emergency dispatcher who took the call says Ronan is a great example of what we'd like to see when someone calls 911. Up next, a tempting change. We discuss why the Pope is suggesting a slightly different translation of the Our Father. And gracing social media, today marks the 5th anniversary of the first tweet from Pontifex. Today is the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and millions of people are taking part in celebrations in Mexico City. The Virgin Mary appeared to St. Juan Diego on this date in 1531. The apparition sparked the greatest mass conversion in history. On this feast day of the patron saint of the Americas, Pope Francis celebrates Mass at the Vatican. Several cardinals, including Boston's Cardinal O'Malley, concelebrated. The Holy Father prayed in his homily for the richness and cultural diversity of the people of Latin America and the Caribbean. He says the face of the Catholic Church is indigenous, mestizo, and black. In an Italian TV interview last week, Pope Francis suggested a line in the Lord's Prayer could be better translated. It was a bit controversial. The Holy Father mentioned the phrase, "lead us not into temptation." He says that it could be worded more clearly in English as, "do not let us fall into temptation." The French Church has adopted that change, and the Pontiff says it better illustrates God isn't the one leading us into sin. Joining us now to discuss is Monsignor Charles Pope, where he's pastor at Holy Comforter St. Cyprian right here in Washington, D.C., is a prolific author. You oppose the idea of changing the translation of the Lord's Prayer, and one of the reasons that you say is because "lead us not into temptation" is most straightforward and linguistically accurate, coming from the Greek.
Yeah, it's just the most straightforward translation. It's in the active sense. It's an aorist active verb, and it's best translated, "lead us not into temptation."
I have to tell you, when I first heard, I thought, no, I don't want anything to change. Please, let's not change the Our Father. And then I thought, well, you know, there is a point there that it does, you could imagine that someone saying that God would lead us into temptation. Do you at all agree with that logic?
I don't know. The other two reasons I would say, one of them is pretty straightforward. I think that in the English-speaking world is one of the only prayers we have in common with the Protestants. And I think it would be an ecumenical setback. So there's just pastoral. That's more of a pastoral, not a theological issue. I think but even theologically, I think what we want to say is that there's an important truth that's being preserved when we say, "lead us not into temptation," and that is that God is the first cause, the primary cause of everything that happens. God leads me in the sense that He goes before me, holding me in existence and holding all existence in existence. He's the first cause of everything, and we in scientific and rational ages, we only focus on secondary causes. We need to remember God ultimately holds all creation together, and that's what that word "lead," I think, says to us.
Well, Monsignor, your very careful, cohesive explanation is, of course, not what the secular media has been talking about. There are a couple of headlines I'd like to read to you. Pope Francis suggests rewording the Lord's Prayer. Pope Francis calls for the Lord's Prayer to be changed. Isn't it true that often Catholic news is oversimplified?
Yeah. He's not calling for it. He's kind of taking sides, I think, on an issue. He prefers the translation that the French have adopted, obviously, and I don't. It's just a matter of difference of an opinion. But he's not directing us to do this. Of course, this would be up to the American bishops and others to stay in union with him. So he's not directing it, and he certainly can't change the actual text, which is in the Greek, the Greek New Testament. It's just a question of how do you best translate it so that people best understand it. There are pastoral issues, but there's also theological issues, and all of those I think have to be balanced. But to be fair, he's not calling for it. He's sort of taking sides on an issue.
Thank you so much, Monsignor Charles Pope, pastor at Holy Comforter St. Cyprian right here in Washington, D.C.
Good to see you. Thank you.
And finally tonight, 5 years ago today, the world saw the first tweet from a pope. Pope Benedict began the official account with this message. "Dear friends, I am pleased to get in touch with you through Twitter. Thank you for your generous response. I bless all of you from my heart." Pope Francis writes today on Twitter, "Thank you for following @Pontifex, which turns 5 years old today. May social media always be spaces that are rich in humanity." The accounts have 40 million followers in 9 languages. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. We are going to leave you tonight with an anniversary near and dear to our hearts.
Name of Jesus, who is Lord, may his eternal word be proclaimed.
This network was formally established and incorporated by Mother Angelica on this day in 1980. It would be another 9 months until she flipped that switch. For our sign-on, happy birthday to EWTN. I'm Lauren Ashburn. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night, and God bless you.